What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel, and I hope that this week's video wets your palate. See what I did there? Because that's the tool that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be dispelling the myths, clarifying the facts, and hopefully I'll be able to offer some helpful tips that you can use for your wet palette at your hobby desk. First things first, I want to talk about one of the most common issues that painters face with their wet palette, and that's curling paper. And to solve this annoying issue, it really goes back to how you set your wet palette up in the first place. To start, grab some baking paper, also known as parchment paper, and be sure that you have parchment or baking paper and not wax paper. Wax paper looks super similar, but it is not porous at all, meaning no water is going to be able to get through and hydrate your acrylic paints. Once you have your paper, you want to cut that down so it's about 1/2 inch smaller than your wet palette on all sides. After that, you're going to want to run that underwater and use something flat to continuously smooth out and flatten the paper. Anything will do, and I'm just using an old gift card. Now, you may be saying, Samuel, you use a Red Grass Games wet palette, and that already has pre-cut pieces of paper that you can simply lay down on your wet palette without all of this fuss. And you'd be right. But I have two reasons why I'm showing this process. One, not everybody has a wet palette that comes with a pre-cut piece of paper that they can simply lay down in their wet palette. So how would they get that wet palette-y goodness? By cutting their own wet palette paper. The second reason, I have not ordered more of the pre-cut paper, and I got lazy and I wanted to figure out other ways to do this, and that was the parchment paper. You want to run water over the paper with a straight edge, getting it nice and soaked through. The main goal here is to get it completely flat and bubbleless. If you were to plop your paper down on a wet sponge with no moisture on top of the paper, it would curl because one side is wet and the other is not. Once you have your paper nice and flat, we're going to fill the wet palette with water to the point right past the sponge's absorptive capacity. Now, this means that it's completely saturated and there is some leftover water that swishes around the edges of your sponge. The last step here is to wipe away any excess water droplets that may be hiding on the surface of your wet palette paper. These little rascals are nearly invisible and they will over-thin your paints if not taken care of. Lots of painters will complain that their wet palette is over-thinning their paints. And I'm almost certain it's because they've run into one of these little water droplet landmines and it's messing them up. Or it could be for another common reason that I'm going to talk about later on. But that's it. Your paper should now lay nice and flat in your wet palette and it won't curl up. And it's going to keep your paints hydrated the whole time that you use them. You don't have to do this, but I find it helpful to have a cup or bottle or something handy so that you can keep your wet palette hydrated over your time using it. The level at which you'll need to rehydrate your sponge depends on the environment you're in. If you're in a more humid environment, then you're not going to need to rehydrate your sponge as often. But if you're going to live somewhere that's drier, like Utah, then you're probably going to need to top it off much more. Something that I'm sure that I'm going to hear about in the comments is how painters who don't use wet palettes say that this is a ton of setup work to even begin to paint. To give some insight and perspective, at least for me, on how often that I do this whole process, I'd say I'm doing this about once per project. Now, whether that's painting up a display mini or maybe a whole game squad, I'm only doing this process for that one project. For example, this is my paint palette after I painted up a squad of Tyrannid termagants. Some of the paint stayed usable for the 3 days that I spent working my way through the minis. I didn't have to do this whole setup process each time that I sat down to paint. And if you want to see those termagants painted up, check out the video linked in the upper right hand corner, and I'll have it down in the description below. I will say that everybody paints at a different pace. From my experience, I'm doing this process probably once every 3 to 5 or 6 days. But with any wet palette comes the question of funk, and what to do with your wet palette when it starts to get funky. Theoretically, using still water should work just fine in a wet palette. However, over time, I can see this becoming an issue, especially because I'm one of those brush lickers when I blend and feather on a mini. It's also inconvenient. Tap water is easily at my disposal, whereas distilled water is not. My simple solution here is to put my lid on at a slant or have it slightly off center to allow for some evaporation to take place. Not so much that my paint would dry out overnight, but enough so that my wet palette doesn't turn into a habitat for bacteria. This is particularly important with the Red Grass Games wet palette as they have a rubber gasket ring that goes around the inside of their lids. This really seals the lid down and creates an airtight seal. Now, I love my Red Grass Games wet palette, but I don't understand why they have to have such a tight seal ring. It's not like I'm going to be traveling with it full of water and paint. But this isn't a review of wet palettes. This is a video about how you can make yours work the way that you need. If you're still worried about bacteria growth, you can always add a little piece of brass or copper to your palette. This helps to deal with bacteria, but it won't get rid of it entirely. Now, what if your wet palette is getting extra funky and isn't stopping? You can actually dishwash your entire wet palette, foam and all, to get rid of any funk. The heat destroys any bacteria, it'll clean up the plastic, and you get a nice clean palette to start with. Now, before you jump up and throw your wet palette in the dishwasher, I'm going to preface what I just said by saying that you should not dishwash your Red Grass Games sponge, as it's slightly different than a traditional sponge. The heat from the dishwasher would likely destroy the sponge. However, that's super easy to clean separately, and if you just use some warm water and soap, that bad boy will get cleaned right up. Okay, I swear, this isn't a video about trying to get you to get the Red Grass Games palette. I've used other ones. It's just the one that I have, and I've used it for a long time. It is good. Maybe I'll do a review video on it in the future, but I'm not trying to get anyone to go buy that. There's plenty of other great palettes out there, like the Masterson's wet palette that'll work just fine. When comparing hard and wet palettes, I say wet palettes win hands down. They keep your paint moist and usable for hours, if not days on end. Leaving your palette out overnight to dry out is okay if bacteria growth really is something that you're worried about, and the other options that we walked through aren't working for you. Now let's move on to thinning your paints. Does a wet palette do this for you automatically as you work from it? Absolutely not. The best way that I think about this and how I explain it is that your wet palette keeps your paint hydrated at approximately around the level of hydration at which you chose to thin it. But Samuel, yes viewer, my paints are still drying out even after all of this great information that you have given us. Well, there could be a number of possible things that are going on here. One, you may be spreading your paint out too much on your palette paper. When you do this, you're increasing the surface area of your paint, and that's going to increase the speed at which the water in the paint evaporates, leaving you with dried out paint. Paint that you leave in those cute little blobs is going to remain usable and moist for longer. Now, if you're like me, and you have just the right color mixed on your palette, but it's too far spread out, it's now dried out, but you need that color. If you want, you can add a couple of drops of water to it to sort of revive it, albeit it'll be more watered down. Now, if the room or geographic location where you paint is drier, that can also cause your paints to dry out more too. The air will literally suck the moisture out of your paint, and that can cause it to dry out much quicker. I would say consider putting a humidifier near you, and that might help keep your paint from drying out. Another big topic that comes up with wet palettes is how they interact with metallic paints. Many people believe that you shouldn't use metallic paints on your wet palettes because the little mica flakes in the paint will somehow get through the paper, end up in your sponge, and then somehow that's going to get into all of your other non-metallic paints, making them sparkly. I wanted to test this theory out, and I'm going to call this the sparkle test. To start, I'm getting some purple paint on my palette, and I'm painting a quick color swatch as the control group without any metallics. Then I'm taking some silver metallic paint and I'm dropping that directly onto my sponge underneath the paper, underneath the purple paint. I'm then going to put the cover on and I leave that for half an hour. After that, I mix up my purple color real good, the color on top of the silver, and I'm going to layer that down next to my control group to compare. When we compare it to the control group, we can easily see that this is a total myth, and the second purple swatch is the exact same as the first. It makes sense when you think about it, really. As painters, we put all sorts of paints down on our wet palette. Why doesn't a purple paint bleed through, get into the sponge, and then tint our white paint? Paint pigments are much tinier than the mica flakes in metallic paints are. The parchment paper pores are too small to allow for particles like this to move through and mess up your other colors. Now, the only way I could see mica flakes getting into your other paints is if you dab your brush on the sponge itself to maybe thin your paint, and if you were to do that in metallic paint and then thin other paints with that metallic-y brush water, I don't really have a solution for that. Maybe consider not doing it, I guess? For some paint organizing tips that you can employ on your own palette, I will often create 2 levels of dilution from the paint that I'm using. One, I'm going to keep the same thickness as it was when it came straight out of the bottle. Now the other, I'm going to thin down with water. What this does is it gives me some wiggle room as I work on a mini, either a thicker paint or a thinner paint depending on what I need. Another paint tip that I know not everybody does, but is helpful for me, is thinning my paints directly on the sponge and the water in my palette. It's convenient, it's accessible, and it lets me get a small amount of moisture in my brush, which in turn lets me tweak the moisture level in my paint to a much smaller degree. And that's going to do it for this video, you guys. If you liked this style of video where I walk through a specific hobby tool and offer some helpful tips and tricks, let me know down in the comments below. If you found the video to be helpful, I'd love it if you'd give it a like, maybe share it with some hobby friends. And if you're enjoying the channel, love it if you would consider subscribing. We're on the path to 1,000 subscribers, and we would love it if you would join the Minicraft fam. Until next time, keep on crafting.